Hey guys, welcome to our last video for the Progressive Era. Today we're going to be looking at women's rights, focusing specifically on suffrage, that is, the right to vote. Here are your video goals. Let's start by looking at women's status in the late 1800s. So by understanding what it was like before the progressive women's rights movement, we'll be able to understand what sort of changes they bring about and what things they don't actually change very much. So basically in the late 1800s, gender relations were determined by this idea of spheres, that there were separate spheres in which men and women were supposed to operate. The man's sphere was the world of public life, work and money, government and politics. Essentially, men were supposed to operate and be active in the public social world where big decisions were made. Women, on the other hand, were expected to live most of their lives in the private sphere. So their job was to take care of everything that happened in the home. They took care of children, they maintained the house, maybe the garden, and they were in charge basically of ensuring that the house was clean, the children were raised to be moral people, and keep everybody nice and clean and orderly and ready to go. So men engaged with the wider world, women were limited to the house and home. This changed during the Progressive Era, and partially it happened because during the Progressive Era, women started to take on larger political roles. One thing that happened during the Progressive Era is that women, like lots of other groups, started to form political clubs in order to take action and to bring about political change. And these women's clubs that formed in most big cities started making specific demands and trying to change society in ways that most women agreed on. What's interesting, though, is that what these women's clubs do is they sort of just build on traditional roles that females were supposed to play. For example, some of the biggest things that they took on were fighting for public schools and the end of child labor laws. So this was an extension of their traditional role as taking care of children. Another thing that they did like this was they expanded their traditional role as maintaining hygiene and order by trying to bring about certain public services like trash collection and sewage systems to clean up the cities. Also, women were regarded as the sort of guardians of morality, and so they took it upon themselves to fight against sort of moral problems that were emerging in these cities. For example, they fought against prostitution and tried to limit or make illegal prostitution. And they also were some of the biggest advocates for making alcohol illegal, because they believed that alcoholism led to child abuse, to the abuse of women by drunken men, and tore families apart. And while the women's clubs were able to make a lot of progress, and it was one of the first times we see women really organizing and playing a large political role in the United States, the main change that happens during the Progressive Era is the spread of women's suffrage. Because until women are allowed to vote, their political impact is always going to be fairly limited. The big organization that ends up really making a lot of progress towards women's suffrage is the National American Women's Suffrage Alliance. This was actually a combination of several different women's rights groups into one giant national group. And what they do is they basically go around trying to spread suffrage state by state. So while it can be really hard to get the country itself to vote for women's suffrage, a lot of states were actually pretty open to it. And they use marches and protests to raise awareness. And during the Progressive Era, almost all of the Western states go ahead and pass laws making it legal for women to vote. And most importantly, the state of New York, which was the biggest and most important state in this time period legalizes women's suffrage. However, there is a lot of resistance, especially in the mid-Atlantic and southeastern states. And some of the arguments that these people bring up against women's suffrage are as follows. One, they argued that women didn't need to vote because they were already represented by their, quote-unquote, their men, that is, their husbands and fathers. So why should women vote when their interests were already being taken care of by their men? Other people argued that women would just do whatever their husbands told them, and so that basically allowing women to vote wouldn't really mean anything because women wouldn't make up their own minds, they would just listen to whatever their husband said, so that essentially this was just doubling the vote of anybody who was married. And last of all, a lot of people argued that women didn't really know anything about government, so letting them vote was not a good idea. These are all arguments that were raised by these states that fought against women's suffrage. A big event that helps to advance the cause of women's suffrage is the First World War. So, because the war requires increased economic production, and because at the same time millions of men are being shipped over to Europe to fight in the war, this leads to an increased role of women in the workforce. Women start to take on jobs that were traditionally male jobs. And what women's rights organizations argue is that because women are now playing a larger part in the U.S. economy, they deserve a larger voice in politics. And if you look at that picture there, you'll see it's a piece of propaganda for women's suffrage that says the country is asking of women to serve as farmers, mechanics, nurses, doctors, munition workers, mine workers, etc. And in response, it says that women are asking for one thing, the right to vote. Now, there was actually an interesting split that happened during during World War I between a radical group called the National Women's Association, or actually I think it's the National Women's Party. I'll go fix that in a second. And they decide that they're going to continue to protest during the war. And they're going to essentially try to humiliate U.S. leaders into trying to get them to pass laws. So while Wilson is saying that he's trying to make the world safe for democracy, they're pointing out that half of the adults in the United States actually aren't allowed to vote. So is the United States really a democracy? But the National Association, or National American Women's Suffrage Alliance, which is the larger organization, takes a more moderate approach. And they say that women should support the war and not worry about suffrage, but then fight for suffrage once the war is over. So they take a more moderate position. Not surprisingly, male leaders decide to support NASA rather than backing up the National Women's Party. So this is a similar dynamic that we've seen in other civil rights movements, where the moderate group wins the support of those who are in power. And after the war, NASA renews its calls for immediate suffrage, and Woodrow Wilson, in one of his last acts as president, says that this is now the time to support women's suffrage. So he goes through on his end of the deal in exchange for NASA's support during the war. So largely as a result of the events that happened during World War I, a 19th Amendment to the Constitution is written up, and it calls for allowing women to vote. This amendment makes the rounds. It's a pretty close vote. Comes down to the vote in Tennessee, and Tennessee ultimately ends up supporting it. And because of this, in 1920, women are now allowed to vote, and they vote for the first time in the election of 1920. And the popular vote increases from 18.5 million in the last election to 26.8 million. So not quite a doubling, but a very significant increase in voting turnout. However, some people would argue that voting is not really enough for equality. And many women continue to press for further measures to ensure gender equality. There are a number of issues that are very important, and that these don't get resolved right away, but they will continue to be fought for in the coming decades. One issue is education. There is still a widespread assumption that most girls are going to go on to be housewives supported by their husbands, so they are not trained to get jobs on their own. Also, women were not allowed to attend prestigious universities, and this continues for a surprisingly long time. In fact, the first woman to get a degree from Harvard University is not until 1963. In terms of career options, most high-status careers remain dominated by men. The vast majority of lawyers, doctors, and whatnot remain male. This is probably linked to the fact that women couldn't attend prestigious universities. Also, unions opposed women in the industry. The unions fought for this thing called a breadwinner wage. And basically what this meant is that women were supposed to stay home and men would be paid enough to support both women and children at home. So both high-end jobs and low-end factory jobs, in both of those, women were discriminated against. Also, on top of this, there were still a number of social restrictions. There was this assumption that men would remain in charge of the household, that is, whatever dad says goes, and that women were supposed to be accompanied by men if they went out in public. There was, of course, some immediate backlash against all of these problems, and it emerges in this phenomenon known as the New Woman, which was basically women refusing to recognize these social norms and going out and asserting their independence and their individuality. The most obvious sort of new woman that emerges during the Progressive Era is this group of young women collectively known as flappers. So the flappers flouted traditional social restrictions in many very obvious ways. First of all, they adopted new styles of dress, abandoning the big, poofy dresses that had been popular throughout the 1800s, and adopting much more revealing clothing. It also allowed for much more freedom of movement, which was, I'm sure, nice. They began smoking and drinking, which before then was largely seen as a male activity. They started dancing. They would go out dancing in the cities, dancing with random men that they met at clubs and stuff, which would have been scandalous, which was scandalous at the time. And engaged basically in casual relationships and romantic affairs with people just because it was nice. So these women, instead of waiting for change from above, just went out and began asserting their independence right away, and of course caused a sensation among more conservative Americans. One thing that's interesting to note is that most of these women tended to be from wealthier families. It was much easier to go out and assert your independence and sort of do these things if you had some money in the bank. Poorer women generally remained stuck in traditional social situations. One other really interesting push for women's rights comes from a woman named Margaret Sanger, who argued for the sexual liberation of women. And she took the very controversial position for the 1920s that sex was actually healthy and natural. Up until this point, Americans and Europeans also had a very sort of restrictive view on sex, and basically sex was seen as bad, and that it should only be done to make babies, that it was sort of your duty to have sex with your wife to produce children. But Margaret Sanger, along with a lot of psychologists at the time period, most famously Sigmund Freud, was arguing that actually sex was a good thing, and that it was okay to do without the intention of producing children. And most people disagreed with her at this point. So when, because of that, birth control, that is contraception, was illegal in the early 20th century in the United States. So when Margaret Sanger was caught distributing birth control in 1916, she was actually arrested for this crime. And she was going to be let off if she had promised to obey the law, but she famously said that she could not respect the law as it was at the time. So basically saying that as soon as they let her out, she would continue breaking the law. Eventually, the courts decided to release her, and she went on to found the American Birth Control League and continued to fight for the legalization of contraception. However, contraception was not made truly legal for another several decades. But so what's interesting about Sanger and about the Flappers is that they are demonstrating the continued limitations placed on women in American society. So even though women are now allowed to vote, they are still in many ways much less free than their male counterparts. However, the fact that women now have the right to vote is another tool in the toolbox for future feminist activists. So we'll revisit this issue when we get up to the 60s and stuff like that. So anyway, that is all. I will see you all in class.